Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen. We're here for a fireside chat with Dr. Parag Khanna on a very interesting and important conversation, investing in adaptation and building resilience. You can only build resilience if you invest in adaptation. My name is Mark Antaki. I'm the head of portfolio strategy for Mubadala, and I'm very honored that Dr. Parag Khanna is joining us. Dr. Parag Khanna is a thought leader, a thinker, a strategist on topics of geopolitics, economics, a leading voice on climate and adaptation. He's a best-selling author multi-times. He's a founder and CEO of many ventures, one of which is Climate Alpha, an AI-powered platform that informs leaders, businesses, governments on climate volatility and managing their portfolios. So I promised you a very interesting conversation. It's a very interesting topic. We're going to try to explain it, simplify it. We're going to speak about how nations, businesses, and societies adapt and build resiliency. And to go through that conversation, we're going to structure it on 2 or 3 big themes. The first one is a big picture, a global context. Let's try to understand what exactly is adaptation, why is it important, does it affect all of us or some of us? Once we'll do that, we'll go into our second theme, which is how do we build adaptation? How do we invest in adaptation? And what's the role of the public and the private sector? What are challenges and opportunities? The third theme will look at the resilience, the resilient networks, the collaboration, particularly in today's world that is fragmenting and becoming ever more complex. So let's go through that journey. Dr. Parag, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Let's maybe start with the big picture, with the global context. We're going to try to explain it. We're going to hear your perspectives on what exactly is adaptation and why is it important. But let me maybe throw a couple of facts. This is what we heard over the past couple of days. The UN announced that the path to 1.5 degrees were off track. There's a course correction that is needed, and without that course correction, we're on a path to a 2.9 degree world. At the same time, this year, it was announced to be most probably the hottest year on record. So naturally, we need to adapt to a better world, to a hotter world. But what does that mean? Can you help us out with your perspectives? You've been analyzing and writing a lot about adaptation. Tell us your perspective.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you to Madla also for hosting this wonderful biophilic pavilion that it is, and thank you all for being here. The agenda that you've laid out is a lifetime's work. It's a civilizational scale of work, and we have 45 minutes or so to go through it all. The facts that you cited are very, very alarming, and they remind us of a couple of things. The first is that we have definitely been not overemphasizing, but neglect at mitigation at the expense of adaptation, but certainly neglecting adaptation, because we have spent the last 5-6 years with an ambitious set of decarbonization goals, which we are not meeting. 58 gigatons per year of emissions, for example. And to be clear, already last month, there was a week when the global average temperature had exceeded 1.5 degrees, so indeed well ahead of the scenario. The other thing to remember about these scenarios is that they're often quite linear in their curves and extrapolations, and this is as a result of some of the mathematics of the early climate commissions, William Nordhaus, quadratic kind of calculations that really understate how seismic the difference is between a 1 to 2 degree temperature rise, or 1 to 1.5, and 2 to 3. It's exponentially worse. It's not linear worse. It is much, much, much worse. And hence we see that if you could craft a more accurate scenario of where the world is going, you would really compress the time scale at the tail end which I mean for non for laymen, is that rather than thinking about the worst case scenario outcome that's being described as simply kicking in 2050, and you can sort of not sit back and rest easy, but wait until then. No, compress that to more like 2030, 2035, and for some parts of the world, be clear that that is happening already. Because the average number, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, is not really the way things play out in the real world. No place is the average place. Each place is on its own journey, right? And there are parts of the world, indeed more northern latitudes, in which things are getting hotter faster. And for them, they're having very negative effects. Think about the forest fires in Canada and in Russia, for example, unheard of, right, at the scale that they have been occurring. Whereas in actual, some of the tropical latitudes, right, it is actually not heating up as fast, and they're quite accustomed to that heat. So in a way, when we speak about global mitigation and decarbonization is a priority and a global public good. However, adaptation has to be undertaken in its own way, shape, and form everywhere. And that comes in many forms. We'll talk about it: infrastructure, migration, investments, and so forth.
You mentioned something quite interesting, which is a non-linear. And you're absolutely right. It's a 3-degree world is going to be very different than a 1.5-degree world. If we take this a little bit more, what does that reflect? And it's typically temperature, precipitation, and drought. And in a 4-degree world or 3-degree world over a 10-year period, we're probably going to end up with every single year having extreme events, isn't it? Versus today, where it's probably once every other or third year.
You know, and we can at least measure in hindsight extreme events because the insurance industry provides us that data. So we're able to see that year on year, the number of billion-dollar climate catastrophes has gone up. It's now in the dozens every single year. The insurance payouts from those events have crossed $250 billion a year and are rising, no sign of abating either. So there is definitely a measurability to that volatility, right? And just to emphasize on this point about how much worse it could be, it's important to remember that when we're looking at that, you know, again, having already crossed 1.5 and how much worse it'll be at a shorter time frame, there are parts of the world where you don't wait until it's 3 or even 2 or 2.5. You can already see it today, and you can imagine that being worse. But the thing about terms like drought and precipitation and so forth, the volatility in this, the nonlinearity, how erratic it will be, is something that I don't think people really quite fully, you know, sort of understand or internalize. And the other thing about drought, it's not that you will have more frequency of drought. When you're in a mega drought, that is it. That is the end of the rain. You don't wait until the next year to see if you had less rain than 0. 0 is 0. The same is true with the drying of rivers, right? To just bring these points home. I get sent, you know, I want to make it very personal and anecdotal. We can come to some travels and places where I've observed this later, but just people send me articles all the time about climate migration. It's a big topic that I work on a lot. And it'll be long essays and analyses and forecasts around the number of people who might become climate migrants. So if these are digital articles, I will do a Control F and I will search for the word drought. And it is not appearing frequently enough in these analyses. To be clear, where there is a flood, you may potentially return to that place. You can take adaptation measures, flood controls, irrigation, and other kinds of things, and perhaps return to that geography. Where there is a drought, you cannot and will not and should not return, right? You cannot survive that. And so these forecasts and estimates around climate migration are massively underestimating the likely total.
So let's 2 points that I want to speak or double click on. The sense of urgency is one that is extremely important. And if we don't do anything about it, it's going to be too late when we're going to realize that it's too late. We'll come back to this one in a couple of minutes, but let's speak a bit about migration. Mm-hmm. Migration, I heard numbers floating, 600 million, some are speaking about 1 billion, and this is only climate related. This is not other crises or natural migration. This is climate related migration. Help us appreciate what does that mean and how much pressure and strain it puts on the welcoming countries and as well
Right.
on the countries from where the migrants are departing.
So the current consensus estimate is that there's about 100 million displaced people in the world today, and whereas historically, if you go to previous centuries, and the ability to look back and in a way taxonomize, this data and kind of classify people by economic migrants, political migrants, and now climate migrants. Climate migration has been statistically insignificant in those historical numbers by century. But according to the International Organization of Migration itself, about 1/3 of today's total number of displaced peoples is already accounted for by climate-related events. So that would mean 30 plus million people, which again, perhaps doesn't really fully state the full, capture the full picture. And that could become far more severe in terms of the total number of people, because in the real world, of course, as you know, you cannot neatly isolate climate trigger from a political trigger, from an economic trigger. We know that these things really do roll up together and amplify each other in life, whether it is in Yemen or Syria or Sudan or other places in the world. So that number is, again, rather than wait till it reaches 500 million because a World Bank report made that estimate, in the year 2022, realize that it is already happening today. The number one thing to accept and appreciate about the urgency of adaptation is that the time was yesterday, right? And this is where I believe that events like this at COP, their evolution and graduation from focusing purely on the mitigation, decarbonization agenda towards adaptation is so incredibly urgent. But the resource commitments have not been made to match. But coming back to the real deep question, it's a geographical question that you're asking. So humans, of course, are limited in their geographical mobility by and large. And so the way I think about this, and you and I once talked about this a while ago, but it's a simulation. We are not a video game, to be clear, but I think it helps to imagine that if you were to take the 8 billion human beings of the world and have a map, as you know, I have such maps and I make them all the time, and put a pixel on this map of 8 billion human beings, exactly where we are today, and then run a simulation. And you would posit that because we are mammals, we are imbued with this fight or flight instinct, right? And mammals will flee, not fight nature, right? You don't want to pick a fight with nature. You will not win. So 8 billion agents in this model, and posit that those 8 billion people will move from coastal areas towards inland areas. Makes sense. They'll move from low-lying areas towards more elevated areas. Makes sense. They will move from very hot places to slightly cooler places, if they can, right? Obvious. And they will move the shortest possible distance, right? Because most people do not have the means to go very far. And then you press play on this simulation. And then if you're exercising the precautionary principle, which is to say, sort of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or just, erring on the side of appreciating the full scope of what could happen and wanting to prepare accordingly, you would get a picture of where people are going. And you would find, of course, those maximum population densities are in Asia. Largest population is in Asia. And one of the things that I have forecast is that there are going to be vectors, geographies, pairings of origin and destination of movements of people that have literally never before occurred in human history. Because the most densely populated, the most populous region of the planet is, of course, South Asia. You have Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, just the contiguous countries. That's about 1.8 billion people. And it is among the most climate-stressed areas in the entire world. And so you can imagine, you can today witness, if you travel to Central Asian countries, the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, you will see an increase, a significant increase in the number of South Asian populations that are in these countries. When in history has there been a growth in the South Asian population of Central Asia and the terrain that we think of as Siberia and Russia? Well, never, right? Never. That's just one example of new interregional vectors of migration. And this is significant because this is the movie of human survival playing itself out. And you don't skip to the end when you watch a movie, right? We are only 3 to 4 minutes in to this 2 hour long film.
So, with all the people movement, already in a world where we're challenged and we're stressed with resources, with health security, with food security, there's going to probably be, like you say, much more movement within the nations, cross borders. So the challenge is not only a developing world challenge or a national challenge. It's a national challenge, it's a regional challenge, it's a global challenge, and it's a challenge that probably the way you're mapping it is gonna be unpredictable and is gonna evolve because there's so many other factors. So it's an urgency matter and it's a global matter with a regional importance.
When it comes to migration, this is extremely important again because you cannot simply teleport from a place in Asia or Africa to Canada. Right? Canada happens to actually be, as a percentage of its own population, the most generous country in terms of inward migration every single year. But it's unfortunately an anomaly, right? We see a lot, and of course they're very selective. It's mostly skilled migration. When we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers due to economic, political, and climate circumstances, they're not the ones going to Canada, right? It's about as far as one can get, from the places that are the most stressed. Hence, we see that the pressure points, right, are Central America. We're seeing this on the U.S.-Mexico border, the Mediterranean Sea, of course, Turkey, or the Anatolian region, which today is numerically the largest collection of refugees in the world, for, again, a wide variety of reasons. You have Afghans, and you also have Iraqis and Syrians and Jordan and so forth. So depending on which region, you will see a different solution, because we do not have, and will never have, and this is very, very important to realize, we will never have a global migration accord. Right? When the governments of the world get together, whether it is here or the United Nations General Assembly, they are representing governments. They're representing sovereign nations. Right? The very definition of sovereignty is supreme authority within your state without outside interference. That's the exact legal definition of sovereignty. Now, so much of sovereignty has been eroded by capital flows, by global governance and norms and regulations and so on and so forth. But the one vestige of sovereignty that remains, that no country would ever give up, for then it would almost cease to be a sovereign state, is controlling who gets to move across its borders. And even in the region of the world, Europe, where the most has been done to transcend that sovereignty and to coordinate behavior and laws and norms and so forth, it is heavily stressed. This norm this evolved norm in Europe of the free movement of people within the Schengen area and the European Union has been significantly stressed by the migrant influx, which has, among other things, climate as one of its drivers. So if that is the case in Europe, you can certainly imagine the scenario that I call regional fortresses, really becoming more prominent, and that would be tragic. It already is tragic. Again, I hate to use the future tense in these conversations. This is present and past tense, and will only be more. Whenever people ask me what will the future be like, my answer is usually more. Right? It's not better or worse. Right? It could be better, more of the good things, and more of the bad things too. And it would be a pity because I think, as you know, for those of us who also look at just economic development and labor markets, right? Most of the places in the world that are receiving and will be receiving climate migrants actually have significant labor shortages, right? They have severe demographic imbalances between old and young, right? They have very large debt to GDP ratios and need young workers and a tax base and so forth. So whereas our political emphasis has been on how to manage or block or stop the migration crisis, from a social and economic standpoint, the priority should be how can we integrate and assimilate and absorb and harness the new demographics of a mobile world.
So it's urgent. The future is today. It's impacting everybody differently with different pressure points. Any form of migration will add strain to the different countries. You need to feed them, to provide them healthcare, financing, shelter, and. So certainly a big and important challenge. Let's move maybe to the topic two,
Right.
which is how do we adapt?
Yeah.
Humankind has always been surprisingly exceptional at adapting. But yet again, this challenge is pretty unique. So let's start maybe with how do nations are adapting today? How do they factor this future prospect and start baking it into their planning?
Yeah.
And give us some examples of, you spoke about Canada, Eurasia, this part of the world,
Right.
other areas that are strained. You've been tracking a lot of signals. What are they doing?
This is a great question, and we could start right here at home, so to speak, being here in the UAE. If climate models alone deterministically dictated our fate, then people look at heat maps, the literal heat maps, and they say, "My goodness, why would anyone ever come to the Gulf states and the UAE in the future?" But for those who are not aware, this country that we are in right now is the fastest growing country by population ever, right? I don't know what the population was 52 years ago at independence. It was a couple of 100,000 people. It's about 12 million today. So you have a 60-fold-ish, increase in the population. That has not happened ever anywhere. And that's despite the fact, of course, that we have the climate change. And what is the reason? Well, adaptation, right? And so, yes, we should always have faith in human ingenuity and capacity to adapt. And even before it was realized how essential, or here in this country, it has, of course, been appreciated how necessary it is. So what does adaptation look like here? Because this is one of the countries that has invested the most in it. It is a great role model and case study. That's everything from, of course, air conditioning. It's land reclamation and coastal sea barriers that can take physical or infrastructural form like seawalls, or it could be natural fortifications and nature-based solutions like mangroves. So all of those things are examples of adaptation that are being done here. Of course, the Dutch are famous for their flood control measures as well, and dikes. Those are all adaptation measures too. Migration itself, of course, which we've already covered, is a form of adaptation. So it comes down to infrastructure, technology, migration. And of course, this is extremely important to point out, to the extent that we can rely on some of the data and forecasts, which again, as we've pointed out, are linear and therefore, partially suspect, it's very clear that the economies of the world that are already most affected by rising temperatures and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change more generally, the double-digit GDP loss is primarily felt in developing countries. And so the worse it gets for them, the more mass migrations you're going to have out of those countries. And again, the further those economies are going to erode. So the adaptation investments would also primarily benefit those countries and regions. However, as I think everyone attending this summit would be aware, the vast majority of climate finance, right, is being committed towards decarbonization goals, which don't immediately trickle through or pass through into local adaptation measures. And so I think that on the one hand, over the last couple of years, adaptation is being talked about more. There's a loss and damage fund and these kinds of things. But the total amount of capital, even prior to the loss and damage fund, when you think about the Global Environment Facility and so on, this is $20 to $30 billion. This rounds to zero, to be blunt, right? It's almost insignificant, and it's certainly not distributed adequately to the places where it's needed. So, other adaptation measures. Again, thinking about infrastructure and technology, can be water desalination and irrigation and drought-resistant seeds and all of these things. There's been announcements on every one of these measures here, but spread this out around the globe, and it thins out very, very quickly. So again, I would balance out the mitigation adaptation investment very significantly.
Dr. Parag, you mentioned the UAE, and it's a topic and a country that I have close to heart. I would like to illustrate what you said with my own example. When I moved to the UAE 16 years ago, you're right, we were probably 3 or 4 million people. Today we're 12, so phenomenal growth. But at the same time, it feels at least hotter today
Yeah.
than when I moved to the UAE. But it's much more easy to live in the UAE today than when I moved to the UAE 16 years ago. The access to everything,
Right.
infrastructure, urban, transportation, healthcare, is phenomenal. And I think that is a testimony to what you're saying, the government's effort to address not only the mitigation, emission reduction, renewable energy, energy efficiency, but at the same time, innovative ideas for agriculture, for air conditioning, for transportation, for urban planning, for infrastructure. And certainly the trajectory of climate and temperature and drought is not going to become much easier over the next years. And a lot of things are still to unfold and to play out. But I echo what you said. Let's maybe speak about climate financing,
Yep.
because I think it's one of the most important topics. You said most of already it seems that climate financing is not enough to get us back to the course corrected trajectory. A significant majority of that, 90%, if I'm not mistaken, is going towards mitigation. So you're left with 10% for adaptation. The majority of that 10% is predominantly public financing, government, concessionary financing. How big should the climate financing envelope be so that we can adapt? And where is that money going to come from?
Well, first of all, the logical case for making these investments in adaptation is crystal clear from a financial standpoint. And as you said at the very beginning, you cannot have resilience unless you invest in adaptation. If you don't have resilience, your economy, your society is not vulnerable to shocks. Just take the analogy of COVID. World GDP sort of froze, right, and declined a little bit. So if we are not resilient to the COVID shock, which we, well, in a medium-term sense, were resilient, but the immediate hit was strong. Climate impacts can be worse than that. So clearly we are vulnerable as a global economy, and we're very vulnerable as national economies to these kinds of shocks. So the case for individual national investment and global systemic investment in adaptation in the name of resilience is very, very clear. And it is insufficient. The numbers that get thrown around are always trillions. Just about everything now, let's face it, we're talking trillions. Trillions for mitigation, trillions for adaptation. And that's not wrong, but clearly we cannot wait for the top-down, overarching, supranational, consensus-based solution to emerge. As we know that with the loss and damage announcement just a couple of days ago, again, that was voluntary. Right? It's always voluntary. So I don't want to portray this in Darwinian terms, sort of every state, every society for itself. But let's be clear that much like change begins at home, adaptation begins at home. Every country literally has to, rethink their fiscal allocation priorities to emphasize adaptation as much as possible in their own interest. So will we get to trillions in that bottom-up way? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the reality is that is what is going to determine the quote-unquote, sort of the winners and the losers, or the adapted and the non-adapted. So this is a place where, because of the adaptation investments, again, the population will grow, the economy will grow. You can almost view it in a zero-sum way, in the sense that people will leave other places to come here and therefore represent a loss to those other economies. So there is something of an inadvertent competition underway among geographies and states to adapt and to be resilient, and the most resilient societies are going to win. So it's going to be, I think, much more a bottom-up than top-down exercise, and part of the reason is fundamentally, let's say, economic or theoretical in nature, which is, as you and I have discussed, mitigation, investing in decarbonization does ultimately benefit everyone, right? You bring the greenhouse gas emissions down, reduce temperature rise, and the benefits are spread across the world. Adaptation is effectively considered a local good, not a global public good. If I build a seawall for myself here in the UAE, it does not benefit a country in South America or the Caribbean, right? And we cannot overcome that because that is physically true, that is geophysically true. But we do also have to have a systems approach to adaptation because we seek global resilience. Just take the example of food. Now, we've had multiple instances in the last decade of significant food price volatility owing to multiple shocks or triggers. It could be heat waves and drought, as happened 10, 12 years ago in breadbasket countries like Russia and others, and that played some role, an underlying role in the Arab Spring. Now you also had the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, you had supply chain disruptions, you had food prices spiking again. Systemic resilience would be engineered by way of investing as much as possible in highly productive areas so that they can be surplus producers of the global goods that people require, like food. Right? So yes, you can invest in drought-resistant seeds for vulnerable and stressed countries, and we must do that so that they can maintain the agricultural economy and activity on which they depend and maintain some degree of self-sufficiency. But when that fails as a result of a climate event, you want to be part of a connected global system in which food can make it to them as they need it. So even though adaptation investments are thought of as local, again, the seawalls and the water desalination and so forth, there is a global case for investing in adaptation that has not yet been made powerfully enough.
So let's try to explore that last point, making it a bit more powerful, particularly to the private sector. Let's put our business or investor hat. You mentioned a figure, $1 trillion of financing. There was the Global Commission of Adaptation that stated that 1.7 trillion is needed by 2050, right, but it's going to create 8 trillion of benefits.
Right.
So the case is clearly there. The urgency is clearly there. How can we think as business leaders, as investors, to drive further adaptation across our businesses? Because let's put it on the table. Today, the ROI is difficult. Yeah. The time horizon is also difficult. The public companies are looking after their quarterly earnings. Private equity think in a 5 to 7 year horizon. Adaptation is a multi-decade thing. It's important. If you're not a lot of private companies are pushing the agenda, but how can we make it even more tangible?
Companies actually do face the physical impact, the financial impact rather, of supply chain disruptions emerging as a result of climate shocks. It does affect their share price, in fact. So we have to be clear that whether it is food, commodities, many other sectors in our real estate built environment, cost pressures, actually do increase as a result of unaddressed climate stresses. And so where we can do a better job of fortifying, in a way, the geographies of production, we have global supply chains for everything, right? So that is actually really crucial for everyone's economic bottom line. Now let's think about it from the standpoint of export markets for corporates, right? I mean, most multinational companies, or many Western multinational companies, and certainly multinational companies based here, given how small the local population is, are looking globally, right, to expand their operations to reach the highly populous emerging growth markets. Take South and Southeast Asia. I mentioned South Asia earlier with 1.8 billion people. If you expand that to South and Southeast Asia, what I call the fourth wave of young, upwardly mobile, urbanizing Asian growth economies, that's 2.6 billion people. Now, to be clear, from all of the studies we have that are forecasting the areas of the world that are going to suffer the most in terms of GDP loss from extreme climate scenarios, those rank the highest. That's where you see the double-digit GDP loss. And those are the same places where, let's say you work for a multinational firm selling whatever it is you're selling. That's where you expect to be selling things? How's that going to work out, right? I think 49 out of the 50 cities, most populous cities that are most vulnerable to climate disasters or stress, are Asian cities, right? So most of the human population lives here or east of here. Much of it lives in cities. Much of it lives in coastal cities. To focus on that geography, because we are talking about the majority, a significant majority of the entire human population. One of the things I realized when I was looking at climate effects on economies regionally is that the rise of Asia, meaning the economic rise of Asia, the industrialization, modernization of Asia, is literally leading to the sinking of Asia. Right? The rise of Asia is accelerating the sinking of Asia because now Asia is the epicenter of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? And Asian sea levels are rising and affecting Asian cities. Indonesia is working on moving its capital and so on and so forth. So this affects those major pillars of the world economy commercially. It affects everyone who is selling to them, and therefore it affects the share price of firms that are tethered to those economies. So there are very significant global ripple effects and exposures there. So when you say make the case, that's how do you make the case?
The case is there. So let's go back to our 13, the resilience. You started addressing it, but let's explore it a bit more. The world is clearly fragmenting more and more. There's clearly a lot of collaboration needed. One's problem is linked to another nation's problem. A nation's solution might help another nations to address its climate actions. How do you think about all this and the broader topic of resilient networks?
So, as we said before, you can't achieve resilience unless you invest in adaptation, but can you measure that resiliency? The residual way of measuring it is sort of, well, did I suffer that economic loss or did I bounce back from that climate shock? That's certainly a good way of thinking about it. But here's where things have to be very local and specific. Every country has its specific sort of circumstances of the risk. Some places will be affected by droughts, others by heat waves, others by floods, others by coastal inundations, storm surges, hurricanes, and so forth. So they each have to calibrate what adaptation measures are most urgently needed. Those are the ones that have to be financed, and they have to kind of have a dashboard approach to looking at whether the capital is going into those projects that are going to offset those risks and therefore have the maximum economic and societal benefit, right? That is the correct way. Now, as I've spoken to and consulted with organizations that try to work with cities in particular around the world, I find that they are still direly lacking in this actionable data. Right? They may have data around their risks because they can even tangibly feel it, just like you can feel it getting hotter. But they are very deficient in knowing exactly what the antidote is. What are the exact adaptation investments and resilience measures that they need to take and where? And what's the best technology to deploy? What's it going to cost? How to put it all together? Imagine 50,000 SPVs, right, to put an investor hat on, that need to be undertaken to solve each of these problems, right? And there needs to be, of course, again, a fiscal role and a fiscal, but as well in terms of capital markets, raising resiliency bonds is something that's coming up more and more. In the insurance markets, there's a lot around, catastrophe bonds and so forth. But I think that a lot can be done for countries to raise green bonds and resiliency bonds. In the multilateral architecture, again, a bit more capital that is being deployed or that can be borrowed against. There's a session going on in the blue zone, I think today or tomorrow, around using the IMF special drawing rights as another way, blended finance and these kinds of instruments. So many of these things have just barely begun to be explored. But I would like to think that if the business case is made in this rigorous analytical way, saying the data shows these are my risks, the technology solution is this is appropriate, it's been tested, here are the lessons learned from other places, this is the capital structure and the time horizon we want to get to work and do this. That is the kind of business plan for geographies that should be backed by investors because the economic benefits are going to be felt.
Dr. Parag, I cannot but ask, you mentioned data, technology. is technology going to be a main solution? And maybe I double click on AI in particular. Is it an opportunity, or is it actually going to come with more challenges because you need to power AI and you need to produce more energy? How do
Yeah.
you think about it?
Well, I mean, adaptation is very much a physical thing. I mean, there are aspects of it that are, of course, so societal, right? Community, cohesion, learning, and so forth. But by and large, it is a physical thing. And some of it is indeed very capital intensive, especially if you're talking about coastal protection and so on and so forth. So it's inevitable that we should think about it in as a set of technologies writ large. Can AI help? Sure, in a couple of ways. One is when we're focusing very much on the climate, you need to downscale climate models. Yes, it's computationally expensive or intensive, but not as much as everyone who's using ChatGPT, sort of today. Remember that we're talking about you don't have to refresh climate models every single day. Right. This is the kind of thing where actually the ensemble of climate models that the scientific community uses roughly, sort of are released to the public every year-ish. And the data gets better and better. So I think that digital technology, sure. We also, part of adaptation and part of the suite of, again, the kind of taxonomy of things that fall into the broader bucket of adaptation include, of course, early warning systems and things like this. So, of course, meteorological data and training that on AI. And there have been a number of breakthroughs recently in this domain that some of the technology companies have published. All of that can be considered part of using, again, AI broadly with climate data to promote adaptation. And that's not the least of our worries in terms of what's driving global emissions, after all. So yes, we should be using it more.
Dr. Parag, I would like to end maybe on a personal note. You have in front of you leaders, community leaders, business leaders, government leaders. From all your experience, your knowledge in the matter, what is the one piece of advice you would like to give them so that they all drive further climate adaptation?
Well, I do think that, let's just continue on the technology theme. I think at the end of the day, we've all read enough reports, haven't we? Right? We've all written enough reports or read enough reports. Adaptation is very much about physical, action to some degree. We started the conversation focusing on migration, which is something that people always think of as a last resort, and I think that's very unfortunate because I do believe that it is, if you're truly sincere in a way about accepting the unfolding reality of climate adaptation and migration, mass migration as one consequence, you need to internalize and embrace that. That's not necessarily technological, but it is a systemically relevant trend. And so I just, in terms of your advocacy and your outlook on the future, I think that's important. But the other dimension of adaptation is very much all of the physical interventions, and think very much about how you can be investing in those in your own society, of course, in your community, because as we said and sort of concede, it's generally localized. But what can you do for other societies in terms of supporting their adaptation is really, really key. And this is the difference from the mitigation piece, because the mitigation conversation is mostly, well, how am I going to reduce my own carbon emissions, my own carbon footprint, contribute to greening my day-to-day life and habits. But can you help others adapt wherever they may be in the world? And I think that's something that is not part of the day-to-day conversation today, and it's a huge part of the future, that I assure you.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we're getting to our 45-minute slot. Like Dr. Parag said, this is a lifetime journey. It's a lifetime experience. We try to unpack it in 45 minutes. If I can summarize a few of the things that Dr. Parag mentioned, it's urgent. The future is today. It's individual, but it's global as well. It starts with small solutions and big solutions follow. We all have a part to play, and it affects everybody. This is going to be felt and impacted by our children and our children's children. Solutions we have, we just need to act, and more solutions are going to come and are going to be developed. But we need to do something, and we need to always do more and more of it. I thank you all for your time. I thank you for your leadership. You're all driving adaptation in one shape or another. I would like to thank Dr. Parag for also your leadership, your perspective, your enlightening thoughts. Thank you very much. And I invite everybody to engage with Dr. Parag after that, and also to take the time to visit our representatives. A lot of our assets and portfolio companies are using a lot of innovative adaptation techniques, and please do engage. This is a global challenge that requires partnership, collaboration, ambition, and drive. Thank you very much. Best of successes for the rest of your COP, and best of luck in getting our world a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.